I was extremely pleased to announce that the EU-Vietnam Free Trade Agreement had been agreed. The agreement will bring the European Union and Vietnam closer together, as well as our economies closer together. In Vietnam, this sense of belonging is strong for me, maybe because of the amazing charm of the Vietnamese people. I came to Vietnam as an ambassador, but I'm leaving Vietnam as a friend.
Hello and welcome to another edition of Talk Vietnam. The European Union and Vietnam have reached an agreement in principle on a free trade agreement or FTA after 2.5 years of intense negotiations. This new step in the cooperation between Vietnam and the EU is partly thanks to the contribution of Dr. Franz Jessen, head of the EU delegation to Vietnam. With his unceasing devotion, the EU ambassador has been instrumental behind the success. In today's show, we'll have a chance to catch up with Dr. Jessen and discover why he has been so dedicated to forging the relationship between Vietnam and the European Union. Thank you very much, Franz, for taking your time out of your busy schedule to be with us in our show today.
It's a pleasure.
First of all, congratulations on making the negotiation between Vietnam and EU Free Trade Agreement a success. You started your term in office with the signing of the Vietnam-EU Partnership and Cooperation Agreement, or the PCA, and then you finished your term with the conclusion of the FTA. Had you anticipated this before you started your term?
It was one of the things I was hoping for. But one thing is you set out a work program when you start working here. Another one is to make sure that it's succeeding. And I was very happy with the two developments. I think the Partnership and Cooperation Agreement gives a very good political framework for our cooperation. And then on the specific trade and economic side, we have the FTA now that has been agreed.
Through your indirect influences and connections, what did you do to facilitate the negotiation?
I think you had a large group of people who were pulling in the same direction, both on the Vietnamese side and on the European Union side. I think part of my job was to make sure that we had enough high-level attention to the FTA, to the negotiations. And there I think we succeeded in getting a number of visits from Vietnam to Europe and from Europe to Vietnam, which helped to set the political framework. I think another issue that we worked on here locally in Hanoi in the EU delegation was that when they start a negotiation, they're always a bit nervous. I mean, what will this lead to and how will it go? And when I arrived in 2011, we had spent almost 2 years on something called a scoping paper, which set out the principles for the negotiation. And we could not agree. The paper was more or less stuck. It went very slowly. And what we decided to do was to make sure that now we work together also with our Vietnamese friends to make sure that this scoping paper would be agreed. And once that was agreed, which happened early 2012, then things started to move quite fast, in fact.
Prime Minister Nguyễn Tấn Dũng and European Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker witnessed the signing of an agreement that marked the official conclusion of negotiations on the EU-Vietnam Free Trade Agreement on December the 2nd in Brussels. Earlier, both sides have gone through a series of intense negotiations. In June 2012, at the European Commission, Vietnamese Minister of Industry and Trade Vũ Huy Hoàng and European Commissioner Karel de Gucht officially announced the launch of free trade negotiations between Vietnam and the EU. Each side has its own objectives participating in the negotiation. Vietnam wanted to expand exports of textiles, footwear, agricultural and fishery products, and furniture to the EU market. European countries was looking for investment opportunities, selling machinery and equipment, and providing services to the Vietnamese market. After 13 rounds of negotiations, the final package of commitments related to intellectual property rights, government procurement. The two sides came close to agreement. After 2.5 years, 14 rounds of negotiations, Vietnam and the EU reached an agreement in principle on Vietnam-EU Free Trade Agreement. Vietnam is the second country in the ASEAN region after Singapore that signed a free trade agreement with the EU. Vietnam will have more competitive advantage than countries such as Malaysia, Thailand, and China in exporting products to the EU market.
The EU-Vietnam Free Trade Agreement is considered to be the most ambitious and comprehensive trade agreement that the EU has ever conducted with developing countries such as Vietnam. Could you tell us about the potential for both sides that this trade agreement can bring?
Yes, I think it's a great time for Vietnam to sign this agreement and also for the European Union. But Vietnam, because you are on a very fast growth rate right now, you can benefit very substantially from the agreement as I see it. It's a forward-looking agreement. It's ambitious, more ambitious, I think, than some had believed when we started the negotiations. And that's partly due to the fact that Vietnam is trying to open up and develop its economy. And here the FTA, and especially as an ambitious FTA as one with the European Union, is very useful to sort of put some of the changes through. I often say that the FTA is not only for the relationship, but it also actually helps Vietnam domestically in order to make the economy more modern, more efficient.
Vietnam is the second ASEAN country that the European Union has ever had a free trade agreement with after Singapore. Why Vietnam this time?
I think it was partly the political relationship. Vietnam was not the natural partner seen strictly from a trade and economic point of view. Vietnam is a developing country. Structures are still to be changed here in the economic field. And we trade more with a number of the other ASEAN countries than we do with Vietnam. So I think the reason why we chose Vietnam was the potential, but also the political relationship between us. That Vietnam, they gave a very clear sign that they were interested in this and they were willing to make fairly substantial changes in order to get an FTA with the European Union. I was very happy to see that. I think there's a lot of goodwill in Europe about Vietnam, and I'm very happy to see that goodwill being utilized for something very constructive.
Vietnam and the European Union had to go through 14 rounds of negotiations as well as some interim sessions since the two sides launched negotiation in June 2012. Could you elaborate with us some of the challenges you encountered during the negotiation process?
Yeah, one of the challenges was, of course, that Vietnam is negotiating a number of FTAs. And therefore, the team that's negotiating on the Vietnamese side, they're being torn by different negotiations. And to make sure that they spend the time needed on the European Union was one of the challenges. And there, the different negotiators, they did a great job. I was also puzzled to see that we are actually using very modern ways of negotiation, if you want. So you have the formal negotiations of 14 rounds. We had a number of meetings between the chief negotiators who, luckily, I would say, know each other very, very well from different negotiations in the past, including the WTO accession negotiation for Vietnam. So that helped that there was a high degree of trust at the very top of the negotiations. Also, we used the office, the EU delegation here in Hanoi extensively because we have good video facilities. So we had a stream of officials coming from the different ministries to sit in our video conferencing room, talking directly with the colleagues in Brussels. I thought that was a very good development. It showed the trust between the different negotiators that they were able to come and talk directly using video rather than insisting that this had to be an exchange of papers and formal meetings and so on. So it's a very constructive attitude.
Mm-hmm. What do you think were the key elements to bringing the two sides together?
I think trust was one. That was very important. But then you have the objective factors that our economies are so different. You have a very young, low-cost labor force. In Europe, labor force is relatively old, relatively expensive. So it means that what you produce here in Vietnam is very different from what we produce in Europe. So also in terms of climate, the products, agricultural products coming from Vietnam are very different from the products that we're producing in Europe. So our economies are very complementary. And that's why we should get together. And we should benefit from you, and you should benefit from us, and that's what we're doing in the FTA.
It will remove nearly all tariffs on goods traded between us. It covers services, investment, and issues such as government procurement. We have now taken then a major step in our trade relations.
The EU-Vietnam FTA will eliminate over 99% of tariff lines. Vietnam will liberalize 65% of import duties on EU exports to Vietnam at entry, with the remainder of duties being gradually eliminated over a 10-year period. EU duties will be eliminated over a 7-year period.
Khi hiệp định được ký kết và có hiệu lực, tôi chỉ nói riêng về vấn đề mở cửa thị trường. Theo tính toán thì chúng ta sẽ tăng được từ 4 cho đến 6% kim ngạch xuất khẩu hàng năm so với cái mức tăng bình thường không có hiệp định.
In addition, Vietnam has committed to improve access for EU companies to a broad range of service sectors, including business and environmental services, banking and insurance. It has also accepted a set of regulatory disciplines in key sectors such as financial services, telecommunications, maritime transport, and postal services. The two sides also agreed upon promoting and protecting bilateral investment.
Chỉ cả trong 5-10 năm nữa thì Việt Nam chưa có khả năng nhiều về đầu tư sang EU. Việt Nam cũng chưa có khả năng nhiều việc cung cấp dịch vụ vào thị trường EU. Trong khi đấy, những lĩnh vực ấy là lĩnh vực rất mạnh của EU, cho nên là tức là gì? Chúng ta lợi ích chúng ta chủ yếu tập trung ở thương mại hóa. Còn lợi ích của phía EU lại chủ yếu tập trung ở cái lĩnh vực tức là dịch vụ rồi mua sắm chính phủ vân vân.
EU companies will be able to bid for public contracts in Vietnam. They will be the first foreign companies to set such a level of access to Vietnam's procurement markets.
The report just outlined the main content of the free trade agreement between Vietnam and the European Union. Could you tell us more about the impact on the two sides' trade and investment after the free trade agreement is signed?
My hope is that the European companies already now will start looking at Vietnam with new eyes, and that they will prepare for the FTA by investing in Vietnam starting already now. And I think they are doing that. We are working with the member states, we are working with our companies in Europe to make sure that they understand the benefits of the FTA. So I think we will see a jump in investments from Europe to Vietnam, which will be very important for future trade between us. We'll also see that some of the products where Vietnam is already competitive, Vietnam will be more competitive in future. So we expect to see, say for example in textiles, we expect to see a greater production here in Vietnam that's being exported to the European Union. And that means that Vietnam has to have a more complete production chain, for example in textiles. It means that some of the items that are not currently being produced in Vietnam will have to be produced here in future. So I think we'll see a relocation of some companies where they will use Vietnam as a production base in a way they haven't done so far.
Mm-hmm. One of the provisions of the FTA is that European companies will be allowed to bid for public procurement contracts in Vietnam. Could you tell us more about this provision?
Yeah. No, I think it's a very important provision, not necessarily because it allows European companies to bid for public works here in Vietnam, but I think it's because it creates a more transparent public procurement system. It means that when public procurement is taking place, there are rules that has to be followed. It has to be transparent. When a decision is being made, it has to be justified. It can be appealed. If one of the bidders feels that there's something that is not entirely correct. So that means that it's a modern system that benefits not only European companies, but also domestic Vietnamese companies. And most of all, it benefits the Vietnamese taxpayer because the taxpayers' money would be used in a more efficient manner.
Mm-hmm. So in your opinion, which sectors will receive the most benefits from this FTA?
I think on the Vietnamese side, I think it would be a number of the sectors where you're already competitive. So textile, some agricultural products, aquaculture. So the ones where the price element is very important, and suddenly now, due to the tariff reduction, that element will be more competitive for the Vietnamese companies. But I also see that we have had a very high growth in some of the more high-tech products coming from Vietnam, and I think that's going to continue that growth. From the European side, I think we will see a major benefit on the investment side. I think some of the European companies who will invest here, they will invest in order to produce for the European market using Vietnam as a production base. And there I would expect that we will continue to do well in the products where we tend to do well. That's machinery, machine tools, and so on.
Dr. Franz Jessen took up the position as ambassador, head of delegation of the European Union to Vietnam in November 2011. During his 4-year term in Vietnam, Dr. Franz Jessen has made remarkable contributions to the comprehensive bilateral relations between the European Union and Vietnam. He has made a significant role in accelerating the negotiations of the EU-Vietnam Free Trade Agreement. The last 4 years have witnessed Dr. Franz Jessen's great efforts in bridging political relations between the EU and Vietnam. Dr. Franz Jessen has taken a more proactive role on presenting the EU's viewpoints on the East Sea. This is materialized in the issuance of the EU statement on the East Sea ever.
During your term in office, there were a lot of high-ranking visits by EU leaders to Vietnam. You must have worked really hard for this to bridge the two sides together. So what is Vietnam's position in EU's external policy?
I think we see Vietnam as a special friend in ASEAN. So we see Vietnam as being a key partner in Southeast Asia. And we have worked very closely with Vietnam. Despite the political differences that we have, we managed to have a very close political relationship, which I really appreciate. I think the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is reaching out very strongly to the European Union. And I find that it's quite easy for us to work with Vietnamese officials, which was something that I did not necessarily expect when I arrived here. I thought that maybe it would be the system would be a little bit stiff, a little bit formal and so on. And they have been very, very pleased to see how easy it is to work with colleagues in the different ministries if we have the right ideas.
Mm-hmm. Having recognized that Vietnam still faces a lot of development difficulties, the EU launched the 400 million euro in a so-called New Development Cooperation Program last year, which is aimed to support the development of domestic energy sector as well as the governance and the rule of law. Could you tell us more about this?
Yeah. I'm very happy that we are extending our development cooperation with Vietnam. We do have a difficult economic time globally and also in Europe. So it's not evident that we are spending more money outside Europe. But we did, and we decided to do that in Vietnam. We have increased the budget by 33%, and we stay here, and it's pure grant money. What are we expecting to get out of it? Yeah, it's basically poverty alleviation is a key part, and therefore I would expect that we will be focusing strongly on poor areas, poor segments of the population. That's on the energy side. On the good governance side, we work very closely with a number of the ministries involved. I would mention maybe Ministry of Justice, because good governance covers a lot of things. It covers issues ranging, say, from human rights to a modern economy. And if you don't have good governance, it's very difficult to get European investors to come to a country. You need to be able to enforce contracts. If there are disputes, you have to have a system where you can go to the courts and make sure that the ruling is fair and unbiased and so on. And there's still work to be done here in Vietnam, and we work very constructively with the government to do that.
In recent years, to help Vietnamese enterprises meet the European market's high standards, the EU delegation has run MUTRAP, or the Multilateral Trade Assistance Project, which launched many training courses for better compliance with technical requirements. Let's take a look.
Export value of Vietnamese fresh food and vegetables has been very modest, accounting for 2.5% of the export sector. The huge EU market yet remains untapped. Realizing this, MUTRAP has helped to launch training courses to improve the production value chain of dragon fruits, aiming to bring this product closer to the EU market.
Mục đích là nâng cao giá trị xuất khẩu cho hợp tác xã, nâng cao nhận thức của hợp tác xã về sản xuất sạch và xanh, và đồng thời là mở rộng thị trường sang châu Âu cho quả thanh long. Yêu cầu của thị trường châu Âu đối với quả thanh long thì bắt buộc phải đạt cái tiêu chuẩn Global Gap, tức là sản xuất sạch và xanh, thực hành nông nghiệp tốt.
Besides training courses, Mutraf has spent about 500,000 euros to provide Vietnamese coffee exporters with the technical and financial assistances needed to obtain fair trade certificate. The certificate is considered a key to unlock the demanding EU markets with a strict standard over product quality.
Chúng tôi chọn làm chương trình công bằng để xuất khẩu cà phê mình cho các thế giới họ được biết cà phê thế nào là cà phê sạch, tính cách bền vững như thế nào. Về cà phê sạch là chúng tôi không dùng các loại hóa chất, là chúng tôi dùng phân hữu cơ trên vườn cây của chúng tôi. Chúng tôi muốn cái sản phẩm chúng tôi sẽ đến tận nơi cho người châu Âu biết rõ hơn xuất xứ, nguồn gốc, để chúng tôi đẩy mạnh về vấn đề quản lý, tính cách bền vững để sang cho châu Âu nhiều hơn.
Thanks to Mutraf, Phu Quoc fish sauce is the first product in the entire ASEAN countries that has been recognized in the EU as a protected geographical indication.
In the past, in the European Union market, we had producers from Thailand and China utilizing the name Phu Quoc sauce, marking a sauce that was not, of course, produced in the Phu Quoc island of Vietnam. You know that at international level, there are rules protecting intellectual property rights. The same for geographical indication. Only the producer of the product can use the label marked like Phu Quoc sauce or champagne or other, and no other can use that.
In 2014, the EU decided not only to maintain its development assistance to Vietnam, but to increase the assistance by 33% to 400 million euros over the 2014-2020 period.
Could you elaborate on the European Trade Policy and Investment Support project? What is its main objective?
It is to create a more modern economic framework in Vietnam. So part of it is to make sure that the Vietnamese officials, they are fully aware of international rules on trade, international standards governing different goods, food products. And it's also to create a better understanding of the potential in the European market. On, for example, we have a system called Generalized System of Preferences, where we give a tariff preference, as it's called, to Vietnamese exporters. But in order to use that, the exporters have to be aware of it. Mm-hmm. And we saw a couple of years ago that Vietnam was not using this as much as we would like them to. So we had a campaign together with Mutraf, the trade project, traveling around the country to the key export places to make sure that the exporters there were aware of the possibilities and how to use them. Mm-hmm. Mutraf has been very helpful also in the negotiations on the FTA, where they have been in the background providing technical assistance. For example, if we needed more information about state-owned enterprises, or Vietnam needed more information about the GIs, geographical indications, Mutraf has been there to support.
In the context of increasing global competition and Vietnam's economic integration, how do you assess the competitiveness of Vietnamese enterprises, particularly small and medium-sized enterprises?
I think the small and medium-sized enterprises will grow very fast in future. There's a lot of talent in Vietnam. You have that the level of education is increasing almost exponentially as younger people they get into the workforce. And therefore I see great growth in that area. What I think we have to do as officials, or on the Vietnamese side, the Vietnamese government has to do, is to make sure that the economic framework is so that the talent of the people can be utilized in the best possible manner. And that's where much of my work is, and the work of my colleagues.
Mm-hmm. So what preparation should Vietnamese companies must make in order to grasp all the opportunities that the free trade agreement will bring?
I think they should be forward-looking. I think they should look at standards, for example, food standards, and they should say, we can do that, instead of saying, oh, they're too high, they're too difficult. So it's the European market is a very sophisticated market, it's a very rich market, and it's also one that requires a lot by the producers. Standards are very high in Europe. And the Vietnamese producers, they should simply look at that and say, this is a challenge that we can meet, because they can meet it.
Having grown up in Denmark, Frans Jetsen's earliest memories are marked with frost and snow and very few people. The heat and vibrancy of Hanoi is therefore a striking experience for him. After 4 years in Vietnam, Frans Jetsen's achievement in leaving footprints here is not only attributable to his hard work, but also to his efforts to understand the country and its people. Frans and his family love to talk to and get to know Vietnamese people, trying the best to live as locals. Wandering around the streets, Frans is happy to see his work in the mood trap being translated into real life.
EU flag. It's the EU-Vietnam trade project. Yeah.
Living in Vietnam, you have had a lot of opportunities to work and to live with the authorities of Vietnam and the people of Vietnam. What is the one thing that you feel most connected to Vietnamese people?
Oh, there are many things. It would be very difficult for me to pick one thing. The food is very special. Living in Hanoi is very special. The people, very special. But the warmth of the people, I think, is unusual here. I'll give you one small example. I had just arrived, and I met somebody from the National Assembly, and he asked me, so what are you doing for Christmas holidays? And I said, oh, yeah, I'm going down to visit one of the provinces in the south. And then he said, oh, that's my province. I'm going to go with you. So instead of having a sort of holiday on the beach with the family for 2 weeks, I ended up traveling through the province for 1 week with a group of officials from the Vietnamese side, which allowed me to see many things that I would never have seen just as a tourist or visitor. And I was surprised that you had a series of officials there spending 7 days just around Christmas, sort of driving me around and showing me things and so on. That you would not find in many countries.
It's a very surprising trip for you during Christmas.
Yes.
The first Christmas in Vietnam.
Yes, first Christmas, yeah.
But you didn't feel Christmas atmosphere at all in the south, though.
No, not much, not much. No.
Because it's really hot over there.
It was, yeah. It was like 30 degrees on the 24th in the evening, I remember.
How does your network of Vietnamese friends help you with your own work?
I think the network, you have two groups here. You have the network that you know through your official functions. And there, through time, of course, you identify some people that you find are easier to work with than others. Personalities are different and so on. And I've found that in the different ministries, there are always 1 or 2 or 3 that actually works very hard in order to get the relationship moving forward. And their dedication to EU-Vietnam has been surprisingly positive for me. Then you have the network of people that you find outside your working life. And there again, many very good friends that can sort of steer you a bit, also help with the language, explain why did things happen as it did when there were cultural differences that I did not see immediately.
How do you assess the potentials of Vietnamese people?
I think that there's enormous potential. I think everybody who talks about the foreigners who talk about the Vietnamese people, they use the word resilience. There's a great strength in the people, and there's a great ability to sort of get up and move on and get things done.
As a head of the EU delegation to Vietnam, how do you balance your work life and your family life?
It's always a challenge. We have one son, he's 10 years now, and I've tried to make sure that at least during the weekends that we spend a lot of time together. He's crazy about soccer, so I've been taking him around to the different soccer competitions for kids.
With Vietnamese kids?
Yeah, with Vietnamese. There was a Vietnamese coach too, and he loves it. And then in the evening, homework, always. Sitting half an hour, 1 hour, trying to go through the different math questions and so on. I was joking with him that I think I'm the best 5th grader in the whole of Hanoi because I know all the stuff, you know. So. This is my son, our son Alexander, and my wife Wang Thi. I was working in Beijing, and that's where we met, and it's 15 years by now. And got married, got Alexander, and stayed in Beijing for 4 years, and we moved on to Brussels. Now we've been in Vietnam for 4 years. We came on his 7-year birthday. He celebrated it in the plane traveling to Hanoi. And started school here in 2nd grade and has moved on from there.
Alexander is the pride and joy of the family. The ambassador teaches his son with a multicultural perspective to encourage Alexander to appreciate and understand other cultures. Having lived in different countries, Alexander can now speak 4 languages.
你跟我说。下一次不想再试。我试了2次，去年我试了和今年我试了。
Hvordan gik det på sommerskolen?
Det gik godt.
Havde du mange venner?
Yeah.
Du har pris l'avion hier?
Oui.
Oui.
Oui. It's just nice knowing so many different languages. Because first of all, when you grow up, you should know more languages, right? So it's easier to start off at an early age.
Alexander? Yeah.
Wait. Yep.
Yeah, you can, yeah.
Even though France is often on business trip, his father and son relationship has no distance.
You look funny, I know that, yeah. What are you trying to do this afternoon?
Boxing.
More than an ambassador,
think it's too
France is a father and husband. He spends his time off from work with his family. A pleasant day could be sitting together and watching Alex play sports. Or the piano. Alex may have gotten his talent for music from his mom, Madame Wang Ji, a singer and songwriter.
Multiculturalism seems to be an essential part of your work. How have you been able to integrate multiculturalism into educating your children?
Yeah, it's very important for me. It's multiculturalism. It's partly being tolerant, not have fixed opinion about the countries and people, but try to have an open mind. It's also a question of languages. Try to speak different languages and communicate with people in their own language. So my son, he speaks 3 languages. He sometimes says 4, but the 4th is a little bit weak, I find.
The 4th is Vietnamese?
The 4th is French. Yes.
French.
We lived in Belgium, and when we left Belgium, his French was actually quite good, but it sort of deteriorated a bit since we came here because he doesn't use it very actively.
Cảm ơn.
How much can you count?
Tạm biệt. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7.
A multicultural family means exploring new lands, learning to speak different languages, experiencing new cultures, and making new friends. Despite having to say goodbye to these people and cities after only 4 years.
Oh, be careful with the big truck.
You're about to leave Vietnam. What is the thing that you will miss the most about the country?
We live in just around Hon Kim, in a wonderful little street. So in the evening, to walk around Hon Kim was sort of a standard family activity. Loved it. I think the Tet here in Hanoi have been very special. We have celebrated all the Tet festivals in Hanoi in the beginning of the festival, and then moved on to the south after that. Very special atmosphere, especially the first morning where everything is quiet and we took our bicycles and tried to ride around the streets. I'm going to miss living in the middle of Hanoi. Living in the middle of Hanoi, where you have sort of in the early morning, you have the rooster starting to wake us up. You have the announcement system with the speaker sort of coming with different things that we don't understand because it's all in Vietnamese, starting at 5:30 in the morning, which is very early for me. It's a very special charm. And then you have sort of the city life that starts. You have the street vendors that come on their bicycles with their small speakers behind, again trying to sell products throughout the night. You don't find that anywhere else. And I'm going to miss that. See the government guest house over there? Yeah. Now we're going to go down to a Nutai Park.
In August 2015, Ambassador Jason officially ended his mission in Vietnam. His farewell party was like a goodbye from a friend.
Tôi phát biểu hôm nay không phải bằng diễn văn, mà tôi nói trực tiếp từ trái tim mình. Tức là ông Francis là một người bạn rất thân thiết của Việt Nam.
The Danish-born ambassador has placed unforgettable impressions on his colleagues.
I really considered Franz a friend, actually from the moment I met him. He was very instrumental introducing me to many people. I got a lot of new friends through him as a friend.
Franz is a very nice guy, and his wife also, and his son. He likes soccer. We discussed a lot about Barcelona and Real Madrid.
You know, his hospitality has been generous to a fault. My family and his family are close friends, and I think we're all going to miss him a lot when he moves on to Manila.
Đại sứ là một người bạn rất là thân thiết của nhiều bộ ngành và địa phương của Việt Nam. Và tôi nghĩ rằng chắc chắn khi ông rời khỏi Việt Nam thì cái tình cảm rất là của người Việt Nam dành cho ông Francis cũng rất là lớn.
Through our conversation, I can feel that you have witnessed a lot of changes to the economy of Vietnam, to the life of Vietnamese people, as well as Vietnamese enterprises. And so as the FTA is about to be signed between Vietnam and the European Union, what is your advice to Vietnamese enterprises in order to get all the benefits that the FTA can bring?
First, of course, they have to look at the FTA and the tariff side, the other benefits that are coming. And then they have to look at the European market. How does that fit, and how does that fit their export potential? I think that Vietnam should make an effort to move up the value chain, to focus on low-cost labor, products that where the labor input is very important, and therefore labor costs have to be low. I think it's not the way forward. They should look at the products where there's an important value added, and therefore that the issue of salary is not key. And I think actually that European companies are very well placed here in Vietnam on that front, because most of the European companies that are here are not here because of the low cost of labor. They're here for the talent of the labor force. That also means that if labor costs go up, they will still be here. And I think that's important. And the Vietnamese companies, they should look at the same. They should look at products where the cost of labor is less important. And therefore, if labor cost goes up, it's fine.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much for spending your time with us in our show today. And it's been a great pleasure and honor for us to have you here. We wish you a great success in your next term in the Philippines. And we also hope that in your new position, you will continue to support Vietnam.
Oh, I will. Thank you.
And that's all we have for this episode of Talk Vietnam. Thank you very much for being with us. And from our team here in Hanoi, until next time.
I think what I'm going to miss the most is probably the people.
I'll miss my friends probably the most.